Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anna Hausman, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the Social Enterprise Club and a second-year MBA student at Columbia Business School. We've had an incredible morning so far with some phenomenal panelists and speakers, and we're excited for our last keynote speaker of the day. Today, I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Sheryl WuDunn. Ms. WuDunn, the first Asian American reporter to win a Pulitzer Prize, is a business executive, journalist, and co-author of Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. She co-founded Full Sky Partners, a consulting firm focusing on double bottom line ventures in technology and healthcare services. She's also a principal at Praison's Partners USA, a firm focused on diagnostics. With her husband, Nicholas Kristof, she is a co-author of 5 best-selling books. Ms. WuDunn won a Pulitzer Prize with her husband for covering China, and she has won numerous other awards, including the Dayton Library Peace Prize for Lifetime Achievement, a White House Project Epic Award, the Asia Woman in Business Corporate Leadership Award, the Pearl S. Buck Woman of the Year Award, and the Harriet Beecher Stowe Prize. Ms. WuDunn's remarks today will be moderated by Bruce Usher, co-director of the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise, Elizabeth B. Strickler and Mark T. Gallogly, faculty director and professor of professional practice at Columbia Business School. Professor Usher teaches on the intersection of finance, social and environmental issues, and is a recipient of the Sigbee Prize for Scholarship in the Classroom, the Lear Award, and the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence. Personally, I can attest to the fact that Professor Usher is a fantastic professor with really insightful questions, so I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us, and Professor Usher, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome, everybody, on this snowy Friday if you're in the New York area. And it's a real pleasure to have Sheryl WuDunn join us today. Thanks, Sheryl. I read your book, Tightrope. We have it right here, and I like your backdrop on your picture. I read this summer, and it's terrific. 2 very significant things have happened since you wrote it, and I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on the implications of those. And the first being COVID, the pandemic, which is affecting all of us in the country. And then, of course, this very important and very heated election that we're just about to vote on, or many have voted on. In what ways has the pandemic and the election amplified what you saw and what you wrote about?
Yes, so thank you, Bruce. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of questions from all of you students, so I hope that you find this engaging. When we wrote Tightrope, we certainly didn't envision, the way this year has unraveled. We actually dove deeply into what makes a lot of these people, in rural areas, also in some urban areas, in the working class, what makes them tick and what makes them, what challenges them. And we discovered that there were huge challenges that COVID, the pandemic, has just magnified in a huge way. The most important thing, and which is what we've discussed in Tightrope, is that we argued for universal health care. And, it's so important to and it's very easy to understand here in a pandemic how important universal health care is. You can imagine that, in the past, elites would think, oh, well, I know it's their problem, and if they don't have health care, there's nothing that I can do. But now it reverberates back to not only the elites, but everyone, because, a lot of the working class, they're essential workers. And if they decide that they can't afford, they don't have good access to healthcare, then, and this is what happened in the very beginning of the pandemic, then they can continue going to work and spread the virus. And that's what happens with an infectious disease. The same is true with paid sick leave. A lot of these workers, they only get paid if they actually show up at work. And again, the same rationale and the same obvious reason that we want them to have paid sick leave is that we don't want them going to work in a pandemic if they happen to be COVID positive and then can continue to spread the virus unknowingly. And so these are some of the examples of how COVID has magnified the challenges facing society, and how we really do need to have some of these, I wouldn't call them subsidies, but targeted interventions, such as universal healthcare, such as paid sick leave. The other area that I would actually mention is education. And that gets into the need for universal broadband access. We always think of the US as number one in everything, right? But it just so happens that in a ranking, called the Social Progress Index, which is a framework based on the work of 3 Nobel winning economists, the U.S. in terms of access to broadband, we rank really far down below a lot of the developed world. We're like in the 40s out of 180 countries, and we always think of ourselves as number one. And we see the impact of this with school right now that has turned virtual for many kids. But when you get to kids in the lower income strata, they don't have access to broadband, especially in the rural areas. So what are they doing for school? McKinsey now estimates that probably about 1 million kids will drop out of high school because they don't have access to internet or reliable internet. It's also hard to actually study virtually, as many of you are very well know. And so again, another problem that has been exacerbated because of the pandemic.
So you mentioned affordable healthcare, universal healthcare, and certainly many of the characters in the book, when I say characters, real individuals, experience health challenges, some very severe health challenges. And yet you also suggest, and I think it's reasonable to guess, that many of them are also going to be voting for President Trump, who's been trying to remove the Affordable Care Act. How do you square those two different issues with the election right in front of us? What do you ascribe the popularity of Trump is, and to the communities that you wrote about in the book?
People voting against their own interests is a very interesting phenomenon. So in many ways, we also vote against our interests. If I'm voting for someone who is going to raise my taxes, that's against my own interest. On the other hand, because I, am, well educated, I have, I don't have a PhD, but I consider myself well educated, right?
Me either, by the way, just a full disclosure, but that's another story.
But I have the wherewithal, so I can afford a little bit of loss. But when you get to the lower income and people that we write about in Tightrope, I mean, these people are barely surviving. There's just no room for give. There's just no extra room that they can afford, if they actually vote against their interests and something happens, like they lose their Medicaid. So in Yamhill, where we talked about, someone like Clayton Green. Clayton is someone who basically Nick knew when he was growing up. He was on the number 6 school bus with him every day riding to school. But Clayton grew up in a different type of household. There were no books, no kids' books. Although the father was, had been in the military, he ran a tight ship. He died early. So then, poor Irene was left trying to raise, 4 or 5 kids on her own. And so Clayton dropped out of high school. So he didn't have a lot of skills. But he then over the time started working for us at Christoph Farms. And he, had a lot of health problems. He, gained a lot of weight. He's 400 pounds. I mean, he was coming to the farm. He used to chop wood, but, over time he couldn't because he was just too heavy, too out of shape. He couldn't even chop the wood. He could supervise, he could fix cars. That's what he was excellent at fixing tractors. But he really, you can imagine someone who's 400 pounds. He was in and out of the hospitals. And he and Irene recognized that, yes, they were thankful for Medicaid. They were thankful for Medicaid. They didn't necessarily know that this was from Obamacare.
Right.
A lot of these people are not, scrupulously following the news. They don't necessarily know which policies were under Obama, which policies were under Trump. So they don't really know, they can't really make the connection between the leader, the president, and a specific policy that affects them on the ground. So I think there's some of that going on. Also, they are living in a bubble. They listen to Fox News, and that's the only station you'll hear. And so Fox News has all sorts of arguments explaining how terrible Obamacare is and how terrible, these previous healthcare policies was. And we've just got to get rid of this mandate. It was a terrible thing. So they only hear that, and they don't have other corroborating sources of news. So that's kind of why you get these two divided worlds. We each kind of live in our own bubbles.
Right. You referred to riding on the school bus, that Nicholas rode on the school bus. I want to quote briefly from the book, and I want to ask you a question about that. It's you write early, right at the beginning, the first chapter, the quote, "The kids on the bus," and this is in the 1970s, "were sure that their world would be better than their parents had been. Yet those kids ended up riding into a cataclysm as working class communities disintegrated across America." So my question for you is what was most troubling that you found in your research on the book and writing the book? What troubled you the most? And I'm going to follow up by asking you, what was most hopeful in what you found?
Right. So Nick and I were foreign correspondents in Asia, and we covered a wide range of topics. From the economy to real poverty in parts of the developing world in Asia. And I saw extreme poverty that I just had never even imagined. I mean, people don't even live in under four walls. They're sometimes living in like the equivalent of lean-tos or in like tents or shacks. I mean, they don't have even a full pair of clothes to wear. It's just a rag, covering part of their body. I mean, this real poverty. And they don't have running water, not to mention electricity. So the poverty there is just of an order of magnitude different from what we see in the US. And of course, in the US, you've got people who, they have a house, or, some people are homeless, but, they might get access to a homeless shelter, which is real four walls, electricity, lights, and everything like that. What we did find, though, is that the pain and suffering that is felt here in the US is absolutely real and just as intense. The amount of pain and suffering and the emotional toll that it takes on Americans is unbelievable, to the point where we saw so many people from abroad just, desperate to immigrate to America because they believed in the American dream. And here we saw Americans who may have flat screen TVs, they might even have a smartphone, but for them, this American dream was broken. And it really broke our hearts to see people like Clayton, who their lives there was no hope for them. And I won't give away the book, but he really didn't have much hope.
Right. So the most troubling thing you came across was the absence of hope, the lack of hope.
Yeah.
And that can really destroy a country from within. Tell me about your optimism. Where did you see hope in your travels? And,
right. So you can imagine that it almost seems as though there isn't that much hope, right? Because there are millions of people who are dying from what we call the deaths of despair. It wasn't just Yamhill, and I want to point that out. This is not a phenomenon. At first we thought, my goodness, why is this happening in Yamhill? Is this, just in Yamhill? But
right.
Discovered that unfortunately it's much more widespread. As a point of departure, we looked at some census data that, and there was a very interesting analysis done by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, two Princeton economists, and they looked at census data and they discovered that while most Americans, almost all Americans, their lifespans are increasing. Our life expectancy is rising, just like other developed countries as well, and developing countries. However, there was one segment of society where life expectancy was falling dramatically, and that was in the working class, middle-aged Americans, like Clayton. And that was because what they discovered was the deaths of despair, three main reasons. Deaths related to alcohol, deaths related to drugs, and suicides, which are at their record highs since World War II. So you think, well, where is their hope?
Right.
Well, actually, we also discovered, to our just delight, that there are so many organizations And there's a lot of research at universities like Columbia University where people are coming up with solutions and applying them and seeing them work. And these were such full-fledged, fully formed solutions that we were, wow, how come this isn't more talked about? Why isn't this more widespread? And so that's where the challenge lies. We have solutions. We just need the political will to spread them around the entire country.
You mentioned political will. I mean, these deaths of despair, the numbers are truly staggering. Opioid deaths alone are over 70,000 this year. And, you know, all the attention and justified attention on COVID, which over 200,000 Americans have passed away from. But there's been a lot less attention on the opioid crisis and other similar challenges.
Well, I actually think that I've heard very anecdotally that the deaths from drugs may even be higher because people are turning to drugs as a panacea because, I mean, they're self-medicating.
The stress of the pandemic and the economic stress and the like. Yeah. No,
So in fact, one of the families that we write about, the Knapps, Dee Knapp is the mother of 5 kids, and all those 5 kids, Keelan, Nathan, Zealand, and Regina, they were all on the bus with Nick, and one by one, they just started, dying. From drug overdose, from cooking meth and a fire consuming Nathan. He just died in the fire. Zealand died, in another fire that happened when he turned out to be drunk. And then Regina died from hepatitis linked to her drug use as well. Another one died just from alcoholism. And then there was one kid left. Keelan was left. And we were supposed to be on a panel together in May. He wanted to tell his own family story, and he was looking forward to that. It was going to be in California. And then we got this phone call in April that, he had lost his job and he had started, turning to drugs, heroin, and he overdosed. And we think it was fentanyl, but he overdosed. And so that's the 5th kid, and poor Dee is still alive. And, she visits their graves. She has a little, hilltop where she has all their graves, and she visits them every day. And it's just heartbreaking.
It's unbelievably tragic. Let me ask you a question that comes up in this course that Anna referred to as Bridging the American Divide course. And we've had some discussions about understanding the balance between personal responsibility and the responsibility of civil society or the government or other institutions here in America. And how do you think about that? I'm sure you've been asked the question, well, no one forced these individuals to take drugs, forced them to cook meth in a lab and the like. So how do you think about that balance between personal responsibility, which is clearly important, and the responsibility of our institutions here in the country to help all? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Look, personal responsibility, I think, is very necessary. We all have to take some personal responsibility. Mm. But what I don't agree with is the extreme to which people have taken that narrative and say it is the only narrative that should govern, the way we operate in society. People often use the term, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. This phraseology came about in the late, 1800s, and it really meant to do the impossible for people, who are so amazing that they can pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But somehow, in the 1970s, it became much more popular to be used as, oh, well, you dug yourself in your own, rut. You got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps to get out. Well, I mean, it literally is impossible. So if we expect everyone in society who falls into a rut to pull themselves out, that's just really unrealistic. And so, but it's become this narrative that allows a lot of people to say, we don't need help. We don't need government intervention. We don't need subsidies. We don't need, we shouldn't be helping anyone because they should be helping themselves. So yeah, you get laid off from your job, but you have to find a new job, even though you've also lost your health care and you may be in a one company town. It's really unrealistic. And, people will say, well, why not? I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. Well, there are extraordinary people who can do that. But if you look at other developed countries, and I'm looking at peer countries like Canada, like Europe, they don't have that driving their outlook. And look how well their economies can perform without this kind of narrative. We don't need this narrative to drive our economy. And in fact, it's hurting our economy much more. And we would do much better, have a higher GDP if we helped give targeted interventions to people like Clayton, keep them in school, for instance. He dropped out of high school. Why not give a targeted intervention so that he stays in school instead of being kicked out? Because he'll, be a better contributor to the economy in the long run.
That's right. Better for him and better for the country. I've always found this expression, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, really ironic because it's physically impossible. It cannot be done. And so the fact that that's an expression that people refer to as a way of explaining how people should help themselves is truly ironic.
But I think if you think about what's driving right now Mitch McConnell not to issue stimulus checks. All right, on the one hand, he says, okay, it's the budget deficits. Well, that didn't seem to matter in 2017 when he passed the tax cuts. But, I think it is like we don't need to give help because people can help themselves. And I think it's important to understand that, the alternative is not, subsidies forever. And that's wrong, too. It really is limited, targeted, help when you need it, so that people can just get back up on their feet.
Yeah. Another issue that's come up in discussion with my students is, in the last several years, there's been a lot more attention on communities like Yamhill and books written like your own, and you mentioned Hillbilly Elegy and others. And this has really, I think, opened up a lot of people's eyes and understanding to what's going on in this country. And I think that was an incredibly important, necessary thing to do. At the same time, some of my students ask me, why don't we see that going the other way? In other words, why don't we see communities perhaps on the more conservative end, or what we call the right side of the country, learning more about communities that are perhaps more liberal, communities like our students? Any thoughts on why that sort of interest appears to go more in one direction than the other? Or is that just a misconception, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's a really good, question. I would argue that there is so much, because liberals write about themselves, there is so much available that people can read about it, and they're on TV. They love being on TV. I mean, I think there's just a ton already available, but there's not really that much available about the other side. So we were really nervous in Yamhill that people wouldn't want to talk to us, or that they didn't want to air their dirty laundry, or that when the book came out that, oh my gosh, they're going to hate us because we painted a really grim and sad picture. And in fact, what we found was absolutely the opposite. They were just so delighted that people cared, that someone cared to learn more about what was going on in their lives. So when we were talking to Clayton, for instance, again, he was very reluctant at one point in time to admit that he actually cooked meth. He was like the meth dealer in town. And it's actually a little bit difficult. There's a bit of chemistry that goes into cooking meth. Not everybody can do it and not kill someone, right? So, everybody saw Breaking Bad, right? It takes chemistry. And you know what? Imagine if he had stayed in school and taken chemistry in high school, maybe he would have been working at a pharmaceutical company. But in fact, he was cooking meth, and he was the town meth maker. He didn't want to admit it. And we're talking to him, this is who you are. And this is, it helps people to understand what you're doing. And, he realized that, yeah, I can trust you, and to present the story, in a balanced way and in an accurate way. And he was then, in the end, he was so like flattered and almost honored to be part of the book because he was someone who was worth writing about.
Right. I think everybody wants to be heard at the end of the day. Everybody wants to be heard, no matter where they are in society. Let me ask you one last question, and then I can ask Anna to take questions from anyone on the webinar. And my last question for you is refers to the title of the book, Tightrope. And that subtitle, Americans Reaching for Hope. But why did you title it Tightrope? What are you referring to there?
When we thought about all of these people, the Knapps, the Greens, and we write about lots of other people. Drew Goff is one particular guy who we write about too. Life for them was really like walking on a tightrope. Any little thing sets them off and they could fall off that tightrope. For people like Nick and I and you and, we're walking on a really, really wide road. If we fall down, we just get back up, but we're not going to fall off a cliff. But for so many of these people, that path is so narrow, it's like a tightrope. And, we've seen so many times, people falling off. So on the number 6 bus, the kids who were with Nick on the number 6 school bus, we looked back and he basically discovered that 1/4 of those kids are now dead from drugs related, incidents, whether it's accidents, from, alcohol, and from suicide. I mean, and related, pathologies. I mean, it's just stunning. And they really, life for them was precarious. And one little thing, I mean, we talk about Mary Mayer, who grew up with Nick and went to school with him. And there were times then she was homeless and she had, she was very depressed. She, 3 or 4 of her siblings, her family members had already committed suicide. And she took a gun. She basically put it to her head. And the only thing that stopped her was saying, I have a daughter I have to take care of. And she didn't kill herself. So you can imagine how precarious that is for her. Life really was like walking on a tightrope. She's in a better place now, but not much better. But she's now, because of help from the church, a local church, she's now got a place to stay. And she is building her own birdhouses that she sells for people. So she's found something to do that can earn a livelihood for her. But it's not a huge livelihood. And she's still, on a tightrope.
It's a powerful metaphor, the tightrope, and I think COVID has probably made that tightrope even a little thinner, a little narrower. Thank you very much, Joe. Really, really appreciate our discussion. Anna, I'm going to turn it over to you if you have any questions from students or anyone participating here.
Absolutely, engaging conversation. We definitely have some questions coming in from the audience. So, want to kick it off with Cheryl. You talk about the role of Fox News and other conservative media that are, arguably in some instances misinforming citizens about different policy issues or things like that. What do you think the solution is to this problem so that everyone can get out of the bubbles that we're living in, both on the East Coast and in Central America?
Yeah, well, if I had a magic wand, I would acquire Fox News. Myself.
And it might be a lot cheaper in a week's time after the election. You never know.
That's right. That's right. So I think this is a real problem. I do think that a plethora of news organizations would help. So that are greater, that widen out the spectrum. On the far right, even further right, I think you've got Sinclair Broadcast. So we don't, obviously they argue that we need much more, programming on that side. But I do think one, programming that is much more widespread that includes, and mind you, on Fox News, it's not so much the news side of things as it is the opinion columnists on the network. So I do think that it's really important to offer alternatives to them that, might be, right of center or a little bit farther right of center, to offer competition. I mean, Fox News basically has everyone. And so a little bit more competition I think would very much help on the right. I was surprised that, one guy who lives down the road from our farm in Oregon, Dave is someone who we write about, but he's a really dependable guy. He's helped us so many times, so we really do like him as a person. He's a very, very decent person. But he also watches Fox News, and he's going to vote for Trump. He cares about gun rights, and that's the only thing he cares. That's the voting issue for him. So he will not touch a Democrat. But he also understands that this world is much more divisive, and he's complained to us about this. He says, I really do worry that, this world is so divided. And, I am concerned to the point where, although he watches Fox News all the time, he says, sometimes I just want to see what the other side is seeing. So I watch CNN. But lately I can't watch CNN because it's all lies. So, CNN is more sort of middle of the road. And I do think that we need more center-right, center-right-right, center-right-right-right to offer competition to Fox, short of a takeover. I think that might be one possible alternative.
That's really interesting. And to kind of follow up with that question, so I have family in the Midwest and in the South, so the phrase "pull yourself up from the bootstraps" is something I've heard quite a bit. And a lot of people would argue that the policies of the Democratic Party might be able to advocate for more like social changes across America. And one question that's coming in from the audience is that if people are being misinformed by news channels like Fox News, how do we get people to back political parties who advocate for broader social changes and make the change like universal health care, improved education, rural broadband services that you spoke of earlier?
Well, I think that we have to start offering rural broadband, and it has to be done by bipartisan efforts. I mean, I think that there are a number of things that if they're done in a much more bipartisan way, I think that people will start to maybe move to the middle, because they'll see that you can offer solutions regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And so I think rural broadband is really key. I know that when we're in Yamhill, and I'll do something like this, and you'll get blackouts every now and then because it's not steady. It's not a steady internet connection. And I think also early childhood education, that is something that is really important. It is much more cost effective to start working with kids when they're really young, even 0 to 5. If you don't work with them on the front end, you're going to pay huge amounts more at the back end when they're adults, and it's much more difficult and costly to actually reform them when they're in jail, or to give them rehabilitation when they're addicted to drugs. I mean, it really is very important. And from the 0 to 5 age range, I don't think that people realize that kids really can start on the wrong foot if they're launched improperly in the point and I say that it sounds like it's a loaded phrase, but the brain architecture is forming when you're 0 to 5. Your brain is growing at the fastest pace it ever will in your life from 0 to 5. So your brains are growing really, really fast, but they were growing even faster when you were 0 to 5. And if you have stress in a household, a baby feels that stress, and that means cortisol is coursing through that baby's brain and impairing the development of the brain architecture. So there's a real biological, process that takes place that actually really ruins the trajectory, or can impair the life trajectory. So, I really think that there are a lot of bipartisan supported solutions that can be rolled out to bring about change. And also, I would say that I think social change, one has to take baby steps, because, something so radical is just too much for people to absorb at once. And I just think baby steps, and then over 10 years, you'll look back and say, oh, wow, that was a revolution.
Thank you so much. Speaking of education, could you talk about the role of vocational technical training programs in these areas? Do they play a role? Are they effective? And have they helped people gain employment?
So we saw what happened in Yamhill, the high school graduation. Mind you, in the primaries debates, a lot was talked about college access. And I know for, students at Columbia University, of course, college access is really, really important. But we should remember that only one in seven Americans doesn't graduate from high school. And McKinsey says that now 1 million high schoolers will drop out. So that's going to be an even higher high school dropout rate, which is really harmful to society, because those people later on, they're not going to have be adaptable. They're not going to have the skill level to help contribute as much as possible to the national GDP. But in Yamhill, what happened was that the superintendent saw that his high school graduation rate was pretty low. It was below the national average, in fact. And so he knew that he had to give these kids some kind of skills, so that even if they dropped out, they would at least have 1 or 2 years of some skills. So he went out to all the local employers and said, okay, what kind of skills do you most need? If you were to hire my students, what kind of skills do you want them to have? And so he tailored workshop training around those skills. And you can call it, it's not so much a vocations, because we don't have vocations the way we did in the past. So, but it's kind of the modern form of vocational training. I don't know. It's low tech, because there's low tech manufacturing now. And so he has boosted the high school graduation rate, but it also means that, not everybody's destined for college. And so, people might gravitate towards, autonomous vehicles. Maybe there's some kind of skill level that can be, developed for people who can help fix those kind of autonomous vehicles. Maybe, I don't know if it requires totally high tech, but there are some areas where, high school, graduates or, just less of graduation can pick up some skills and therefore, be trained. But I also think what's important that we don't recognize as a country is retraining. So we always think of retraining programs as, oh my goodness, they're a waste of time. They never work. Well, in fact, in Canada and in Europe, they work really well. And I'll briefly talk about one example. After the financial crisis in 2009, the automakers laid off a lot of auto workers. And so we had a chance to see what happened to the auto workers in Detroit and also over the border in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. So in Detroit, what happened was these workers lost their job and they lost their health care, because the health care came with the job, and they got some unemployment insurance, was great. Over in Canada, in Windsor, these people lost their jobs, but they did not lose their health care because Canada has a national health care program. And then the government kicked in and looked around to see what kind of areas needed workers. And they discovered that healthcare was an area that needed workers. So they facilitated retraining programs for those auto workers so they can actually get retrained and learn, enough so they can get jobs in the healthcare industry. So the result was these people were retrained and they were put back into the workforce much earlier on. So, years later, they weren't self-medicating, they weren't depressed, they weren't, wallowing in, unemployment. And we all know how long it took Detroit to get back on its feet. So targeted, limited interventions, with retraining that was very successful can really be a powerful formula here in the US.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that example. Kind of switching gears just a little bit. I know you've traveled quite a bit in your lifetime across the globe and across the US. Have you seen any parallels between what you've seen in the US and other countries? And how would you recommend, I'm going to make this a two-parter if that's okay, because I know we're running close to time, especially in light of COVID, when we can't travel, how would you recommend learning about different communities and helping our own individual selves, learn about different kinds of Americans?
Well, first of all, in terms of, do you mean travel within America or overseas?
Both.
Okay. Well, so overseas, what we found was that there were a lot of contrasts between what happens in developed countries overseas versus, the US. And it was very interesting because it actually makes me more hopeful, because there are policies that you can adopt that actually, help you, emerge from these problems that we are mired in. Look, all countries have a drug problem. all countries have alcoholism. You're not going to get it down to zero, but you can reduce it. So, for instance, in Portugal, they have adopted a public health approach to drugs. So they actually legalize drugs, but they make people come to, places where they can get the drugs and also be monitored. And then they actually try and give them drug treatment. And, that's the way to actually change the way people, view drugs. And their heroin addiction rates have dropped by 2/3. And they are the lowest rates of heroin use in the EU, which is pretty stunning. Other countries. So, for instance, we were puzzled by why Denmark is able. So, McDonald's workers. We went to a McDonald's in Denmark, and they pay their people $22 equivalents an hour. And we're thinking, well, how on earth can a McDonald's survive if it's paying their workers $20 to $22 per hour? Well, it turns out after a lot of, investigation, turns out, in McDonald's around the world, they're usually about the lower 20% of the labor force. In the US, the 20%, bottom of the labor force doesn't necessarily have a high school degree, doesn't necessarily have a driver's license that is reliable. It may have been taken away from them because they had some infractions on their record. They may have a dependency, and so they don't show up to work all the time. Or, if they don't have reliable transportation because they live so far away, then they're also not necessarily coming on time. They can't really add very well, so they make mistakes a lot, and they don't speak as articulately. There could be lots of different problems. In Denmark, a person at the 20%, that labor force area, they have high school degree, they are numerate, they are very literate, they have a reliable driver's license if they need to drive, they don't more likely not have a dependency, and they will show up to work on time. So they are fully productive. So you get your $20 to $20 worth of productivity. And that's what makes it possible. So, increasing I don't say that increasing the minimum wage right away to 20 to 22 is the answer, because you need that education, level to be elevated as well. You need to invest in human capital so that these people can become at the level of $20 to $22 per hour. But I think it's kind of it's going to be an iterative thing. You need to raise the education level, raise the minimum wage, raise the education level. It's going to be something that will take some time in the US. But again, it's very hopeful because it shows that we can adopt certain policies that can solve and address some of the problems we have in the US.
Really interesting. Thank you. One more really quick question. You mentioned that there are many social entrepreneurship organizations like the one at Columbia CBS that have the right solutions to tackle the issues you spoke about. How can you expand the reach of these programs and extend their impact into struggling regions?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that Columbia is well positioned because the research is important. I think that there are some programs, for instance, we write about a program in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're trying to collect 10 years of data. They're trying to do randomized controlled trials so that they actually can publish and then show the rest of the world that this is something that, here are the results that are validated according to the gold standard, randomized controlled trials. And so I think that's really important to show that it works. And then the next stage is to, get the financing so that you can actually spread it and scale it. And so, it does take a lot of work, but, a place like Columbia that has the reputation, that has the influence, and that has the network can really push those kinds of programs along. And yes, you need a kind of program like that in every city, and several of them in every city and in towns. And so I think that it's a process, but it's just like the way a business expands. You start, one place and you keep expanding and keep expanding.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to pass the mic over to Professor Usher for a closing.
Thanks, Anna. I'll take the virtual mic. So Cheryl, let me ask you one last question to wrap up our discussion. And I'm gonna start the question with a quote from my esteemed colleague. I was really pleased to see Joe Stiglitz quoted in your book. Really an amazing individual. We're very lucky to have him at Columbia. He wrote, quote, "Can we afford to provide this middle-class life for most, let alone all, Americans?" And then you concluded that paragraph by writing, "Our answer is yes, we can recover our footing." So my question for you is really for everyone on this presentation who's participating. If you could leave a parting word or two to any suggestions you have to them as future leaders in business, as future leaders in government and policy, what advice would you give them about being able to address the issues you found in writing Tightrope?
Thank you, Bruce, for that question. Because I really think there's a ton that can be done, and especially for people who are leaders in business, there is so much influence that you have, and so many perspectives that you can share with the rest of the country. So, for instance, if you look at the Business Roundtable, in the past couple of years, a lot of the companies signed on to focus on stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism. Now, a lot of people will say, "Oh, that was just like, talk, no action." And that's fair. It's a fair criticism, but it's a first step. And I think that what we have to recognize is that stakeholders in the business, including labor, is really important. In the 1970s, basically, labor lost a lot of power. It was just like yanked from labor and given to corporations. We've overshot. We're going too far, that corporations have too much power. And we need to give more back to labor. And, there are a number of economists have said that the decreasing influence of labor has accounted for the lack of progress for a lot of labor. And I think that that's really important because as we see, the COVID pandemic has made clear that workers are essential to making this country run. And if we want the country to be even more competitive on the global stage, let's look at the global stage. You've got China with 1.4 billion people. You've got India soon to have 1.4 billion people. And you've got little United States with 325 million people. How are we going to compete if we don't have as many Americans operating at full capacity to their full potential? We are just not going to, we're going to get creamed by China and India. But we don't like that. We don't like to be creamed. We like to be number one. And so corporations really can help with that. By making sure that, workers get retraining, if they're laid off, that they, operate as obviously you have to be sustainable as well. So you can't just totally give away, spend money where you're giving it away and then you have to shut up, close shop. But I do think in as much a sustainable fashion as possible to spread the wealth a little bit more. Our salary, the gaps in salaries are just, enormous between the top earner, usually the CEO, and the smallest worker. Do we need that big of a gap? Let's think more about the stakeholders who contribute to the corporation, who contribute to the economy, and how we can make that sustainable so that America can remain number one in so many industries, in so many areas in the world. And, we're all on the same team.
We certainly are. At the end of the day, we are. And I like your comparison about the future of America and where we're headed with China and India. It's incredibly important. We keep that in mind. Cheryl, thank you for that advice. To learn more, I strongly recommend everyone on this Zoom read Tightrope. And Sheryl WuDunn, thank you on behalf of the Tamer Center, all of our faculty, our staff, and our students. Really, really pleasure speaking with you today. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everybody. It's nice to see you. Thank you, Anna, Diana, and everyone else.
Take care. I'm going to conclude today's set of speakers with a couple closing comments, and then we'll wrap up here. First, I want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our speakers, our volunteers, our co-chairs, our center faculty and staff, and of course, all of you for joining us online today. We're here to execute on the Tamer Center's mission, which is to educate leaders to address pressing social and environmental challenges. In fulfilling this mission, the conference digital event series is a hallmark of the center's goal to create a space for the innovation and exchange of new ideas across campus. Whether you're part of a nonprofit, a social venture, philanthropy, whether you feel passionate about healthcare, mass incarceration, ed reform, climate change, affordable housing, or international development, we have a responsibility to invest in the future. I hope you will continue to join us for these important conversations. The entire series will showcase a wide range of ways to have social and environmental impact, covering topics from racial equity to ESG and impact investing, ed reform, sustainable fashion, sustainable food systems, social ventures, renewable energy, journalism, inclusive housing, healthcare, and more. I trust this conference has highlighted the various opportunities available for you to use capital for good. And on behalf of the entire Tamer Center, we look forward to seeing you online in the near future. Thank you.